Good afternoon and welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's August webinar. My name is Ryan Stewart. I organize and host the webinars for the ORC. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to log in. In the meantime, I invite you to jump into the chat and add your name and where you're logging in from, and maybe your outdoor recreation highlight from the summer. When you type in your response, make sure that you address it to everyone so everybody can see what you have to say. For me, it was backpacking trip through the heart of Strathcona Provincial Park here on Vancouver Island. Two friends and I hiked from the Elk River Trail to Myra Falls Mine, stopping at the Golden Hind along the way, which is Vancouver Island's highest mountain. We spent 4 days backpacking and we didn't see anybody for 3 of them. So that was my highlight. I'm going to pop both the question and my answer into the chat here for everyone. And feel free to... Oop, that wasn't what I meant to do. And I will allow everybody else to do the same. And in the meantime, I will let you know a little bit about today's webinar. We're going to be recording today's webinar, so you don't have to take any notes. And we will be emailing everyone who registered the recording and the slides and key takeaways a little later this week. Pop any questions you have into the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them. And we'll wrap things up around 1 p.m. Pacific time. All right, we're getting some people here. Aviva has been logging some time at Squamish on the trails there. Nice work. I think Aviva might have been all over the place this summer. Yeah, so feel free to log in there and add anything else. And I think we will get going here. So I'm just going to share my screen and get started. Sorry, just bear with me here for a second. There we go. Can we see the screen? Yeah. All right. So again, my name is Ryan Stewart, and I work on community engagement with the ORCBC. We're going to get started with our webinar for today, and the topic is trail planning, best practices, challenges, and opportunities. This is the theme of Erik Morden's graduate thesis, and we have Erik with us today to share some of what he's learned. I'm going to add a link to this thesis in the chat in a moment. His research looked into best practices to ensure trails, and particularly the process of building them, can deliver meaningful outcomes beyond a recreational amenity. Erik's work aligns really nicely with what the Outdoor Recreation Council is all about. We represent more than 100 nonprofit organizations, including the clubs that build and maintain many of the province's trails. They in turn represent more than 100,000 British Columbians, snowmobilers and hunters, climbers and hikers, conservation organizations, and mountain bike clubs. It's a diverse group, but they share a love of spending time in wild places. The ORCBC is the only provincial organization that represents everyone whose passion is in the outdoors. We advocate, educate, and empower these groups. Today's webinar is part of what the ORC's mission is, and that's to build a sustainable outdoor recreation sector in the province. As a nonprofit, we rely on outside funding sources to do everything we do, including this webinar. You can support our work by making a donation. All donations are tax deductible and eligible for tax receipt. You can find out more at orcbc.ca. Here's today's agenda. In a minute, Erik will begin his presentation. When he's done, we'll open up the conversation to a question and answer session. If you have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the Q&A. Someone might be able to answer them directly, but more likely I'll pose them to Erik during the Q&A session. I apologize in advance for any questions we don't have a chance to get to. We'll wrap things up around 1 p.m. Pacific time. Immediately following the webinar is a super short survey. Please take a moment to fill it out. It helps us do a better job with all of our webinars and everything that we do. I'll also know that we're recording today's webinar, and we'll be emailing a link to with the recording and key takeaways and resources later this week. Finally, just before I introduce Erik, I would like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the ancestral territory of the Comox First Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, we're making a donation to the Ketolach community school. Erik is a planner in Pemberton, and the school is part of the nearby Lillooet Nation. It teaches about 240 students Lillooet language, culture, and values alongside a standardized academic curriculum. That mix includes outdoor recreation opportunities in nearby parks, trails, and elsewhere. All right, so let's get on to the webinar. Erik Morden is here with us today. He completed his thesis to earn a master's in community planning from Vancouver Island University. He's now part of the planning team at the Village of Pemberton. His background is in academic research, grassroots outdoor initiatives, parks and trails management, and community planning. He brings a really practical and interdisciplinary approach to recreation and land stewardship. Erik, thank you for being here, and I will pass the floor over to you and for you to tell us a little bit about your thesis and what you discovered.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I'll just share my screen here. Awesome. Does that look okay for everybody?
That looks great. Yep.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to begin with saying thank you to the ORCBC as well as Ryan and Louise for inviting me here today. It's very much appreciated. I know there's a lot of students across the province doing really great work, and sometimes there's not the opportunity to reach a broader audience. So I do feel quite grateful to be here today. As Ryan mentioned, this presentation is the result of my thesis work. I would like to take the time to thank everyone at VIU who was a part of this, including my supervisor, Dr. Sylvie Lafreniere, as well as my committee members, Dr. Kimberly Coleman and Aggie Wheel. As you'll see by the title, this research did focus primarily on trail planning within mountain communities, but I do believe its findings speak broadly to the trail planning landscape within the province as a whole. And I think the findings you'll see are interesting and relevant for anywhere who has trails or who is interested in developing trails. Furthermore, I'd like to specify that I'm speaking about land-based trails today. As Ryan also mentioned, I am a community planner with the Village of Pemberton. However, wanted to clarify that this research exists in isolation from my employment, and today I'm speaking as a researcher and not as a staff member. I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Lillooet Nation. And I'd also like to thank the Snuneymuxw and the Comox First Nations, whose lands I lived upon for the duration of this research. So today I've actually decided to structure the presentation very similarly to that of my defense itself. I thought that was kind of a nice way to do it. The defense was 20 minutes, so it was rather focused on the process, the methods, key themes, and then some kind of takeaways or conclusions to both trail planning and then community planning as a whole, given that this research existed within a planning school. My objectives were to support the development of vibrant, resilient, and connected mountain communities across BC through the planning, development, and maintenance of recreation trails. In this, I sought to improve understandings of the trail planning process in BC mountain communities and the mechanisms required to support trails, explore the role of community participation and collaboration in the planning process, and celebrate the role of trails and trail planning as a tool for strengthening relationships to ourselves, each other, and the land. This research topic was the result of my own recreational, professional, and volunteer experiences in trail use and planning. I believe it's important to contextualize the identity, experiences, and values that shaped my interest in pursuing this topic. Trails are something I hold quite closely to my heart, and I'm motivated to contribute to the betterment of the planning field and examine the role that both myself and trails can play in the building of healthy, just, and resilient communities, particularly in a time of reconciliation as well as climate crisis. In addition to being an avid cyclist, skier, and trail runner, I've previously engaged in trail-related work with the City of Coquitlam, Village of Cumberland, Tayax Adventures, and BC Parks, and previously sat on the board of directors for the Tri-City Off-Road Cycling Association. Furthermore, as a white, cisgendered, and able-bodied male, I would like to acknowledge that my access to and comfort in outdoor recreation spaces has often been taken as a given and is the direct result of generations of land dispossession, exclusion, and the marginalization of others. While it is my hope that this research speaks to the complex and at times problematic structures that exist within community planning and the outdoor recreation realm, I understand that I write from a position of privilege and am part of a system that upholds and reproduces the very structures I seek to critique today. Furthermore, I'd like to note that in Western literature, recreational sports are often viewed as an apolitical arena where people are simply trying to take care of themselves, stay healthy, and enjoy time outside. And of course, there's truth in such sentiments. However, it often fails to acknowledge that recreation is not inherently good, and experiences can differ between participants if they're welcome to participate in the first place. So why did I decide to focus on mountain communities? Mountain communities in BC are often characterized by rich natural and social cultural diversity, but also a variety of social, environmental, and economic challenges not often faced by their more urban counterparts. This could include things such as declines in population, industry, and uncertainty about the future. Furthermore, the benefits offered by mountain communities are increasingly threatened by climate change, land use development, resource extraction, and environmentally and socially damaging governance practices. Existing literature notes that such challenges demand comprehensive place-based strategies that diversify local and regional economies and increase resilience to current and future threats. And this is where trails come into the picture. Mountain communities that are rich in recreational amenities are experiencing revitalization across the province. Interest in and demand for outdoor recreation spaces and trails is on the rise, particularly since COVID-19. And despite all of this, the importance of trails to the overall well-being of these communities has generally been unrecognized up until this point. Because the value of trails has not always been recognized, understanding of the processes and the mechanisms required to actually make trails happen is limited. If we are to keep up to the increasing demand for these spaces, we must first understand them, invest in them, and build them in ways that are respectful of the many different users and interests involved. This requires looking at trails as multifaceted and composed of both human and non-human dimensions. Notably, trail planning is increasingly complicated by an evolving patchwork of interests and parties and is heavily dependent on volunteer-led, community-based recreation organizations to function. With this in mind, the scope of the research was to explore how trails could support the development of these communities. And to answer that primary question, I first sought to improve understandings of the trail planning process itself, considering the present-day opportunities and challenges across mountain communities in BC. Essentially, I looked at 5 sub-questions to inform the larger primary research question. Those are, what are the opportunities, trends, and best practices in trail planning? What are the barriers or challenges related to trail planning in BC mountain communities? What is the role of community in the trail planning process? What is the relationship between trails and reconciliation? And how can the trail planning process become more collaborative? The primary research method used for this research was semi-structured interviews. The data resulting from the interviews was qualitative in nature and based on the experiences and opinions of individuals directly involved in the trail planning process. Interview participants were purposefully selected due to their knowledge of the topic and their experience working in trail planning related work. A range of different trail planning professionals were invited to participate to build a diverse and well-rounded set of data reflective of the many different parties involved in the trail planning process. In the end, 14 interviews were completed. In relation to my research questions, the interviews generally focus on 6 key topic areas, which form the basis of my findings. I took these topic areas and pulled out key themes that arose. In addition to such themes, I've also included references to related recommendations that you'll see going forward as I work through the themes. I'll also touch on a few quotes that I think spoke well to the complexity of the topic as a whole. So the first key theme that came out is this idea of more than a path. Trails serve as an integral part of day-to-day life for many residents in mountain communities and act as more than just spaces for recreational or leisure use. Trails contribute to healthy, adaptive, and resilient communities and are pathways to connect to ourselves, each other, and the land. Trails can both attract and create community and act as one of the few places where people can access the outdoors in the modern world and form a relationship with the natural environment. Additionally, trails can contribute to local economic development, not only as a draw for visitors, but as a catalyst for associated industries, events, and programs. This is a quote that I found summarized the general sentiment of this theme. I think trails are something that so many people in the community see as being a real positive thing. There are so many activities that you would just not be able to do if it wasn't for the trail network. That simple little path through the woods just seems to resonate with so many people. I'm not going to try and say 100% of the community gets out on the trails, or there's a huge number of people within the community that do. Throughout the findings, another key theme that emerged was this importance of this idea of community-based trail planning. When I say community-based, however, I don't just mean the physical location of trails in relation to the community. While such proximity is critical, so is the idea that trails are planned by the community and for the community. To this end, it's when these three interpretations of community-based collide that the benefits of trails are realized and vibrancy, resiliency, and connectivity can be fostered. Beginning within the community, whereas historically trails may have existed somewhere in the distance at the end of a failing logging road, the evolution of trails today is that of access out the front door. As such, if a community is interested in protecting existing trails or pursuing new trail development, the focus should be on proximity to and connectivity with the community itself. Successful examples of this include communities such as Squamish, Nelson, Cumberland, Revelstoke, and Whistler. Because these communities have trail networks close to home, it means that trails are no longer just a weekend outing, but a component of everyday life. By the community. Trail user groups possess an extensive knowledge and understanding of local trail networks and the broader interests of the recreational community. As such, it is important that the community plays a leading role in the trail planning and decision-making process. In addition to the increased likelihood of support for the outcomes of the trail planning process, early and ongoing involvement of the community can also build social capital, which not only helps flatten hierarchical structures, but facilitates a more inviting space for others to become involved. The final interpretation of community-based planning is ensuring that trails are being planned for the use of the community itself and not for tourists or visitors. While tourism is a byproduct of a successful trail network, it should not be the focus. Community-based trail planning is about focusing on the fundamentals and building trails that the community will use, care for, and love. It's a misconception that for successful economic development, trails must be catered towards tourism. In fact, community support is the critical success factor for outdoor recreation to take hold as a viable economic driver within a rural or mountainous community. The entire community must see the benefit in the trails and in recreation access, from youth to families to small business owners, healthcare providers, and everyone in between. There is an increasingly large number of parties engaged in trail planning in BC. Throughout the interviews, it was noted that these groups or players largely work in isolation from one another, and there's a need to increase collaboration if trail planning is to be successful. Without establishing ways to work together, the benefits of trails cannot and will not be realized. There are a variety of examples and best practice in collaborative planning across the province that came up throughout the interviews, including the Land Access Agreement in Cumberland and the Shuswap Trails Roundtable in the Shuswap region. These collaborative planning initiatives are about far more than building trails or producing plans. They are about experimentation, learning, change, and the building of shared meaning, consensus, and capacity. Trail planning is complicated and its outcomes are important to retain involvement. However, the most important consequences may be in the process of planning, including collectively establishing viable, flexible, long-term strategies for action. Recreational experiences can lead to deep emotional and symbolic connections to land, sport, and each other. While many of these connections are conducive to establishing a sense of community, belonging, and well-being, it is critical to also acknowledge the complex origin of such connections. Trails and the recreation activities that take place upon them have been part and parcel of the hegemony of property relations and settlements as we know them today, and have been encouraged to the exclusion of Indigenous peoples' access and livelihoods, as well as to others on the basis of race, gender, age, class, and ability. As such, there's a need to break down the exclusionary nature of outdoor recreation spaces to support equitable and just outcomes for all of those who reside within mountain communities. This could look many different ways, including embedding different worldviews into the trail planning process, focusing on more responsible recreation, improved accessibility and inclusivity in trails and trail design, planning for climate change, and building meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and other government agencies. While community-based collaborative planning initiatives can serve as a starting point to finding solutions in this space, it also requires an openness to new ways of knowing and a reimagination of one's own relationship to recreation, to land, and to community. Here's a quote that I find speaks well to the need to be open to new ways about building relationships and understanding the importance of reconciliation within the trail planning process. If we don't reconcile that relationship, and as non-Indigenous people, if we don't reconcile our relationship with the land and have a relationship with the land that involves stewardship and care, reconciliation cannot move forward. That's the central piece, and it's the part that no one talks about. And that's where trails are so important. It's one space where most Indigenous people, as well as non-Indigenous people, have any opportunity to enter into a relationship with the land. Trails are going to play an important part of creating a space where we can end up having very difficult conversations in a way that's more open and welcoming and allows people to sort of make that mental shift that they have to make in order to really understand reconciliation and internalize it. Such work is difficult, though, and only possible if the recreation and trail planning system is supported, and currently it's not. Recreation sites in Trails BC and BC Parks were noted as underfunded, recreation groups overworked, and local governments often not understanding the financials nor process of building and maintaining trails, whether they fall within their jurisdiction or not. The importance of trails to community well-being will only continue to rise, and I think we're witnessing firsthand across the province in all of our communities and trail systems. As such, it is time that outdoor recreation and trails receive both respect, but also financial support that they very much need, in particular, the community groups who are leading the charge. Most trails in BC are largely developed, provided for, managed, and maintained by recreational organizations. The responsibility that governments and communities have placed on those clubs has far transcended the traditional role of maintaining trails for themselves. They're now building, maintaining, and operating trail networks for the greater population, for tourism, for visitors, and for many community members who aren't club members. And that's a huge burden. It's a burden financially, organizationally, there are liability risks associated with that. And so we have to figure out how to support it if we're going to continue with that model. We have to figure out how to better support those recreational organizations with sustainable funding, not grant funding that they have to apply for and they may or may not get on a yearly basis to do a specific project, but core funding to support clubs and trails groups. And although trails have been a part of life in mountain communities for millennia, the ways in which they are used, how they are planned, and what they may look like are evolving rapidly. The trail planning landscape is becoming increasingly complex at the very same time that the demand for trails and recreation is on the rise. Participants noted that there is a need to establish the values and objectives of the discipline as a whole, and that also there's limited opportunities in BC for one to learn the skills or the knowledge required to engage in such work. This quote kind of speaks to this changing, ongoing evolution of trails and trail planning. Cycling and trails will come and go over time. Mountain biking as we know it today, the trail networks we know today are relatively young and evolving incredibly fast when you look at them within the world of mountain biking. 30 years ago, we had unsanctioned trails showing up based off the infrastructure of the logging industry. In the last 10 years, we've had an insane explosion of sanctioned trail building and unsanctioned trail building. And who knows where cycling will go in the next couple of years. It's kind of wild to think how quickly it's evolving. And I think that taking the time for people to build relationships and think a little bit more about when creating these trails and the trail networks and the community, it would go a really long way. When things are changing really quickly, to think about what we're doing and the impacts it has. A few areas for future study. The findings of this research largely spoke to the benefits that trails may bring to communities. While participants noted some of the negative impacts of trails, there's space for further study around such impacts and ways to mitigate them. A few of the negative impacts of trails that arrived throughout the research included impact on Indigenous rights and title, environmental degradation, human-wildlife conflict, and increased traffic to environmentally or culturally sensitive areas. This research also largely focused on what I would say the how of trails or trail planning, the mechanisms and processes required to make trails happen. There's opportunity for further exploration into what trails could be or trails could look like, which I would define as trail design. Trail design topics that emerged throughout this research worth further study include updating best practices in trail design or trail standards, the relationship between art and trails, interpretive trails, diversity, equity, and inclusion in trails, accessibility, cultural trails, and storytelling through trails. This research also approached trails from a community building point of view with an emphasis on what trails could mean for the communities and the people who live there. While less focus was placed on trails as a tool for attracting visitors, it is clear that with strong trail networks come visitors and the need to manage and leverage visitation to better support land use decisions. As such, opportunity exists for further study related to vegetation management and tourism to improve understandings of the environmental, social, and economic impacts of trail-driven visitation. And lastly, the benefits of trails to a local community are plentiful, but this does not mean they're welcomed by all. This research was written from a perspective of knowing that the demand for and interest in trails is rising, and therefore it's worthwhile to improve understandings of the process and explore ways in which it can be done meaningfully. This is not without acknowledgement that trails can change communities in ways that some may not be ready for. They bring visitors, but they also bring new permanent faces who may have different opinions, views, and attitudes. In addition to any social tensions that may arise between locals and visitors or long-term residents and newcomers, amenity migration and increased tourism can also bring increased pressure on community services, infrastructure, housing, and changes to community character. As such, it's important that each community finds their own balance in managing their appetite for change, and that trails and outdoor recreation are one part of a vibrant, resilient, and connected community, but they're not an answer for all of their challenges. Kind of pulling this apart and taking it a bit broader to planning as a whole, despite challenges and the lack of support, trail planning in BC serves as an example of best practice in participatory planning. For without co-creation and collaboration amongst community groups, volunteers, governments, landowners, trail systems in BC would not exist. Additionally, trail planning demonstrates that planning does not have to be a top-down technocratic process, nor does it even have to be done by planners. Planning is an act of community, and without community involvement in the planning process, planning outcomes will never be loved nor supported by the community. And lastly, trail planning exemplifies the values of place-based planning. For only when people and place become intertwined and inspired by one another can we then begin to build vibrant, resilient, and connected communities. As with any project, this research was subject to limitations, with the primary limitation being time. This was completed within a 2-year course-based professional master's program. So while I would have loved to give unlimited time to the work, I was limited. Data collection and interviews were completed over the summer months of 2024, which also made it challenging given that the summer is a busy time for many engaged in trail-related work due to the need to undertake field work, trail building, or site visits. As such, there was many people who were interested in participating in the study, but simply did not have the time to do so. And I think it's important to note kind of the positionality of the participants. Many of the respondents who participated were interested because trail planning is not just part of their work, but a passion. As such, I think it's important to note that if there was a broader group of backgrounds and occupations, from people who not necessarily trail planning is their passion or their love, but rather just a part of their job, I think it could have resulted in more critical or potentially negative insights. And while this was my intention, it was simply not possible to speak with everybody who is involved in trail planning. Just a few concluding remarks. In the time since my research was completed, already much has changed in both the world and in trail planning. BC parks and rec sites, for example, have amalgamated. The political, social, and economic landscape of North America has shifted, and the climate crisis has continued to intensify. It's my belief that the importance of trails as more than just pass through the woods will only continue to rise. For trails serve as places of connection and reflection, and provide opportunities to engage in a relationship with oneself, each other, and the land. As such, I leave this research with humility in the sense that trails may seem small, but also with confidence in knowing that they do matter. Trails and the process of planning them provide the opportunity to deliver meaningful outcomes for communities, and as such must continue to be supported, protected, and most importantly, celebrated. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was fantastic. Sounds like it was a really interesting summer of research, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was very interesting, very busy, dynamic, juggling work and interviews. It's always challenging, but super rewarding.
Was there anything in your research when you went through that process that surprised you, or was it all sort of, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, sort of stuff as you heard it?
Um, I think for the most part, I went in with, assumptions or projections of what I may have found, kind of working within this space for a long time. And I think what came through is relatively aligned with what I had anticipated. But I think really this idea that almost all of the best practices that came through, or all the stories of success, were really rooted in kind of two main things. One being collaboration and the other being led or heavily involved with the community. And I think those 2 points was something I maybe expected, but it was very clear once the research was actually completed.
Nice. Okay, well, why don't we jump into the question and answer session? So if anybody has any questions, you can pose them in that Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. And I'll just start asking some that we got during the registration. We have groups that are more water focused. You mentioned at the beginning that there was, you thought lots of applicability here for communities that aren't necessarily mountain communities. Do you think there's any adjustments there, or would you say that it's all like very transportable depending on the environment that you're looking at?
I think like if we were to remove roads from the picture, trails and waterways are kind of the ways that humans and animals move along the land. And I think in that there's always going to be overlap. And I think the real overlap is in the fact that a trail or a river will likely cover many jurisdictions along its path from trailhead to terminus or headwaters to the ocean. And I think finding those different groups that have an interest in that pathway and getting them together to work in a way is critical. Um, I used to do a little bit of work in watershed stuff, and kind of the river roundtable model was always something that kind of inspired me. And I was like, oh, this could exist more in the trail world. And then through my research, I kind of found, oh, it does exist in Shuswap. Pemberton has a model very similar as well, like a working group. So I think there's a lot of commonalities between the two.
Yeah. We have Sandra Ritchie's here with a question asking about any thoughts about or any conversations or thoughts about trail safety in the sense of trail user safety, signage, partnership, collaborations, incident prevention, data driven, anything along those lines. Was there much
Mhm.
conversation in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, my research was largely thematic. I didn't look at any quantitative data. I think one thing with trail planning in BC and a lot of the magic of trails in BC is kind of this organic nature of how it developed. And I think for a long time that's been great. But now as the numbers, of people using these trails and accessing them is increasing, that's where I think there's an opportunity for, good planning principles to be implemented. And that's where I think, signage, education, relationship between motorized or non-motorized, that's where I think we can make a big difference. And kind of approach trails from a bit more of a holistic point of view and embed some of these traditional planning principles to make sure that users are safe and that conflict is being avoided, especially between different types of users.
Yeah, we also had a question about that actually. What did you hear about that? It's particularly to multi-use trails and avoiding user conflicts. Were there any best practices for design, construction, or management when it comes to those kind of conflicts that you heard about?
Yeah, I didn't really focus on motorized use of any kind, and one thing that came up was I think motorized trail planning and non-motorized have often existed in isolation. And there's certain groups now who are, even if the trail plan itself is non-motorized, they're inviting motorized users to the meetings and just kind of getting a better understanding of what they're after and their different interests. And just making sure if there's going to be overlap, how is it done and where are the right choke points or the right contact points and where should it be avoided entirely.
Um, a couple of the questions that are coming in here are talking. One was talking about local government support for trail planning and worrying about sticking their nose in when they're not haven't been kind of welcomed into that fold. We've got Grant and Aviva here talking about collaborative planning. Does it ever get too many cooks in the kitchen and kind of drive people away from the process because they feel like it's too bureaucratic and cumbersome? Um, did you hear some of those contexts and do you have any advice when it comes to those sorts of thoughts?
Yeah, I think if I was to speak to like the too many cooks in the kitchen comment, I think it's very important to acknowledge this is difficult work and these collaborative models don't always work because of the time that it takes. And I think you see that firsthand if you've ever been involved in any process, whether you're planning a trip or you're planning a trail network, people have different opinions. And I think we're seeing now for a long time, trails could kind of exist in the bush and be a little bit rogue and no one would really, it wasn't a big deal. You could probably build a trail and it wouldn't get found. And now I think we kind of have to reapproach our relationship to recreation because this is kind of the reality of what it is now is things take time and there's boxes to be checked and maybe there'll be a learning period, like a storming, I guess if you're thinking of like building a group and where things are a little rough, but as we kind of build understandings with one another and ideally improve our processes over time, these things can become a bit more efficient. Um, and there was one section throughout the paper I kind of talked about like there's a need to build capacity before we're building trails. And I think right now it's difficult to jump into some of these collaborative models without the capacity. But then at the same time, the capacity comes through collaboration as well. So it's kind of finding that balance of like getting external supports, whether that's money or training, but then also working through things kind of together and figuring it out.
Um, you talk about that alternative framework for community building that's bottom up and collaborative rather than top down and extractive. And I feel like that's kind of where you're going there. And
Mhm.
Louise is asking, do we need a formalized recreation planning framework from the province that kind of supports the local efforts, or would that sort of flip that on its head? Like, where do you see that leadership coming from?
Yeah, I think it's a balance. I think like in BC, so much of that magic is coming from the bottom. It's coming from, groups of people that came together to advocate, to protect, to steward, to build relationships. But at the same time, we look at these larger systems in the province of, rec sites and trails BC or BC parks, and their funding is severely limited. They're doing great work, but they're doing the best they can with kind of the resources that they have. So I think it's like if those systems up of maybe higher up levels are supported, it enables the community groups or it enables the community itself to do the work. But when the system itself is not supported, then it's very challenging for everybody. And we're struggling to provide top-down direction, but then we're also struggling to build, these community groups are often volunteers or it's, one or two paid positions. So really supporting both sides and kind of letting the community do the work that they can do requires I think, a bit of broader support from the top.
Hmm. Um, and I just wanted to touch before we move on. Aviva was asking about sort of building off that idea of how you build that grassroots effort. And if you have people that don't have that planning experience, but you want them to come into that trail planning, did you see some examples of effective ways of doing that folks are doing out there and sort of to bring people into that process in a way that everybody feels welcome and they're
Mm.
regardless of their experience?
I think there's a lot of people that maybe don't know what is actually going on within within their own communities. And I think a good place to start is just becoming curious and, seeing, oh, is there a community trail association in my neighborhood? Is there, somewhere like a trail day that I could go volunteer on? And I think that idea of just getting out there and meeting other people and improving the understanding of the process, it's like, oh, this is what happens, like we talk of this idea of like trail fairies where trails just like magically appear, but they don't. And I think for all of us as recreational users, like next time we go riding or hiking or whatever we may be doing, just like, oh, I'm curious, like what's the history of this trail? Why is it named this? Who built it? Who maintains it? And just kind of being a bit more reflective of like where we're recreating, the stories that are associated with it, and kind of maybe how can I help out? I know my bike maintenance bills are quite expensive, right? So if just kind of like, okay, if I'm giving this much money for my new derailleur, how can I give back to the trails that I'm using this bike for?
Yeah, and we're definitely getting some questions about that, and so I think that funding piece and the support for these volunteer nonprofit groups. It's a constant struggle for many of them in general, like the how do we keep doing this? You mentioned it needs to be, a good quote there from John Hawkins about it. It needs to be, or maybe it was you, I can't quite remember now, but the idea that it can't just be grants all the time, that there needs to be some core funding here. Have you seen some examples or hear about examples that would work in BC or you think would be a good idea for us to use?
Well, I think the one thing with funding in BC is, especially grant-based funding, is it's largely project driven, where you are assessed on a grant by the product or the project that you can deliver. And that is encouraging, the creation of often new trails or new networks entirely, where we're leaving behind what's already existing. And that's where the real challenge is like, how do we maintain these community assets? So I think if we could transition grants to be a bit more inclusive of like, this doesn't just have to be capital or it doesn't just have to be project driven, but it can be used to fund a trail crew of students who can get out throughout the summer and, throw dirt and do drainage and community engagement, things like that. Another example or another trend we're starting to see is like local governments. I think there was a comment, I didn't fully read it, but local governments have traditionally they've had recreational trails, but they're more community trails. They're not outdoor recreation focused. They're connections between the swimming pool and the shopping mall or whatever it be. And I think now we're starting to see local governments take interest in the trail networks that exist around their communities, whether that's in their jurisdiction or not. I believe the District of Squamish funds a trails crew or contributes to a trail maintenance crew. And none of those trails fall within the district. They might be on private land or they might be, crown land, whatever it be. Because at the end of the day, the municipality is benefiting from having a strong trail network. It's why people want to live there. It keeps the community healthy. Um, so I think that's one thing, and some local governments just aren't actually aware of how much is going on to make these trails happen. So maybe you go to council with, I think there's a quote in my paper, Thomas Schoen made, and he said maybe, you go to council with a delegation showing we contributed 1,500 volunteer hours, we maintain these many trails, we had 100 people come to our race, whatever it be, just kind of demonstrating the benefit that you're giving to the community and kind of seeing, well, what can you give back? I think that's one way to tap into some potential funding, where, trails compared to an ice rink are a lot cheaper to maintain. You don't have two Zambonis and, HVAC systems and whatever it need be.
Hmm. Yeah, we did a great webinar last month, and the topic was all about the funding, and folks can find that on our YouTube channel or on the ORCBC's blog if they want to link back to find out some of the stuff that you talked about. We had the United Writers of Cumberland, Dougal Brown there, who I know you interviewed for this, and he talked about Cumberland, the village of Cumberland contributing to their maintenance every year
Mhm.
with a consistent 3-year agreement that they could rely on. So things like that are starting to happen. I got Grant there in the comments talking about in Whistler and the resort municipality having a 5-year agreement there with Warka for similar sort of stuff. So
Yeah, the having to do it yearly, it's such a time commitment. Now Warca, for example, would have to have someone every year applying for grants. Securing that long term, it's a lot easier to manage your projects as well if we have this much funding coming in each year.
Yeah.
It's that long term planning.
Hmm. On the planning front, someone else asked about, whether there needs to be sort of an order to the planning process, sort of that land use planning, which looks at things on a very large scale, region wide, and then kind of work your way down to these local things, or is it okay to just be focused on that local area and not worry too much about how it fits into maybe the other recreation amenities in the area, or how that fits into everything else that's going on in the land? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mhm. I think starting at a low, personally, I believe, and I think the findings of the research speak to this as well. Starting at a more local level, I think is beneficial. You think of how we're talking about the difficulty in collaboration when you have 10 interest groups, right? Taking that to a regional level, you might have 40, you might have 50. So I think kind of focusing on, the community and then maybe writing ways to tie in with other regions or, establishing a community-based plan first. And then, maybe Quesnel has one and Clinton has one and whatever it be. And then now that those are established, we can find ways to tie them together. And I think when I speak to like place-based planning as well, if people can see, the community that they're within and the trails they're within, there's a better chance of their involvement. Where it's like, okay, I can see like the Fat Tug Trail Network from my window right now in Pemberton. It's like, okay, if there's a project around planning there, I can become involved versus, 3 watersheds over on a regional level. It's a bit harder to grasp.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to jump to this question from Mike Upton. He's asking about the economic benefit, social, environmental benefits from trails and communities. And a lot of the communities that you were sort of looking at are definitely seem to have embraced this, the benefits these activities, the trails bring to their communities. Did you hear much about pushback in communities and the over tourism idea and things like that, or was it largely supportive?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I know from a resident, I've lived in multiple mountain communities, and I know from my own experience, you hear both sides. I think if you're looking at it from more like an agency or government point of view, I think it's generally welcomed. Some of these mountain communities or rural communities are struggling with, retaining family doctors or, property tax based, economic development, these larger challenges. And if trails are part of, creating a place where people want to come and they want to build families and spend their money and their time, then it's welcomed. But it's doing it in the right way, right? It's making sure that it's at a growth or a pace that's sustainable and welcomed by the community. And that's where it really should be led by the community, right? And that's planning, perfect planning as a whole it's reflective of what the community wants, rather than like stamping a trail network down without it being developed in concert with the people.
Okay. Um, we have quite a few groups that do deal with recreational access challenges with back roads. I know most of the communities you were looking at were more front country, and you sort of
Mhm.
touched on we're not talking about trails that are way down the road there. But even in say like a Pemberton or a Cumberland, there are roads that access some of these places. And what did you hear there when it comes to concerns about backcountry road access, gates, maintenance of those roads and those places? And did you hear any recommendations of how to work through some of those sorts of challenges?
I'm not sure if this was the result of my questioning or me trying to keep my own scope within kind of community based, but I was actually a little bit surprised at how little that topic came up.
Hmm.
There wasn't a ton of discussion around that. that could have been my own doing, the way I was framing things. But definitely, yeah, there was some comments, deterioration in logging roads. And, if we want that, say, a key bridge to get to a network, replacing that bridge is very expensive. Um, and I think where the opportunity would exist is with kind of tenured resource users, where like, okay, if there's a mining company or forestry company who's in that area, do they have an interest? Maybe their interest is they're the ones that maintain the road, right? So we didn't think of them as being relevant to trails, but we're using their infrastructure. So in that sense, maybe we could get them involved in kind of, provisions for recreation or provisions for maintenance within these larger forest management plans.
Okay. Yeah. Um, Conservation and sustainable initiatives. Did you talk much about that with the folks that you were engaging with, and did they talk about how trails and these areas can fit into kind of broader strategies for, whether it
Mm.
is 30 by 30 sort of commitments on biodiversity or just conserving kind of green space close to communities?
Yeah, there was definitely discussion of like using trails to ensure connectivity, or okay, if we have a trail or like a throughway that now we can connect these greenways, that's one thing. Then there was also discussion about, okay, where do we not want trails to go? What areas are better left undeveloped, kind of finding that balance, and also updating our kind of, like I said, I didn't speak too much around trail design, but updating our trail standards to, address things like drainage, water, trees. Um, I believe it was the Fernie Trails Alliance that were saying, they're still doing maintenance from the 2021 atmospheric river. And those types of things are going to continue to increase in severity over time. So finding ways to build trails that hold up to a changing climate, but then also, encourage or protect these areas that are important.
Hmm. And how do you see them fitting into that? I mean, do they look at a trail network as being part of that solution for say a biodiversity commitment, a goal? Like, are these trail managers sort of seeing that, or do they see this as a recreation amenity that's sort of separate from that other goal?
Yeah, there's definitely like a subfield called like recreation ecology that kind of is trying to tie the two together. Um, in terms of like land managers or what they see as goals, I'm not sure. Um, I think there's opportunity there, but like I said earlier, like, trails aren't inherently good either, and they can be extractive in their own ways, or damaging in their own ways as well. So I think it's finding that balance of, working with the local conservancy groups or, okay, it's grizzly bear season. Maybe we're now introducing seasonal closures or things like that, where it's like recreation is important, but it's part of a larger ecological system, and just kind of being a bit more reflective or responsive to those changes.
Yeah, technological advances. I think you touched on this very briefly in your report. I mean, like the apps, social media, it's all shaping outdoor recreation trends and user expectations and all those sorts of things. Was there much conversation there about those impacts on trail managers and how they're sort of responding to those and how that affects their ability to plan and do these sorts of things?
Yeah, definitely, rise. Social media didn't come up again. Another thing, maybe I'm surprised didn't come up too much. But I think it's almost at this point like assumed that people know like this rise or increase in interest in outdoor recreation is in part because of social media. And improved bike technology or whatever it be. It's more people accessing the trails than ever before. And I think that definitely comes down to those larger planning challenges as well. As like, okay, how do we disperse people or maybe concentrate people? Like whatever there maybe is like the approach would have to be different for each network. Like in some places, it's like, okay, it's best. This is really sensitive area. It's best if we just almost intensify and keep everybody on this one trail and maintain that trail versus other areas where the issue is overflow of people, then maybe it's a disperse or a layering of trails. Sorry.
You got all kinds of stuff going on
Yeah, I
here.
got bugs, noise. Yeah.
Um, I'm just looking at Mike Upton's question there. Your diagram of collaboration keys showed a lot of players. Is there not one body like BCPF or BCP attempting to organize these parties? Has the conversation, including the benefits of their goals and goals of outdoor equipment companies, begun?
Would that be BC Parks and BC Parks Foundation? Is that
I'm not sure. Mike, can you specify
yeah.
there? Yeah, okay.
Um, yeah, I think like in general, like yeah, Rec Sites and Trails BC is kind of one system where like a trail, say a new trail is being developed and it would go through like a Section 57 process and it would kind of fall on the recreation officer to kind of, okay, this has to go to a referral here. This has to go to the resource group here. And they're kind of just making sure that that process is sufficient. And I know that I believe the province is looking at updating that process. That's something that was discussed. I'm not sure how far along they are in that. Um, yeah, equipment companies, that's another thing. And I think Grant had made a comment as well, is, at what level do they become involved? Or the local bike shop or the trail running store. And that's a potential revenue source where 1% of every purchase, 5% of every purchase is going back to the trail system. I think that's something that is a little bit untapped. Not even untapped, like I think it should be happening. You're starting to see some trail shops, have like or bike shops or whatnot, will have a QR code to donate. But I think if you look at like, the hunting industry, they've long taxed the purchasing of hunting equipment goes to support the conservation of, their game. So maybe outdoor recreation is something that could pull from that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's another funding source or something more ongoing.
Mhm.
Um, where do you see your research kind of impacting trail planning in the province? Where do you see this sort of fitting into, or what would you like to see happen with the research you've done there, and how would you like it to be sort of used by, the audience, by trail planners, by
Mhm.
the folks you interviewed?
I think it was not so much about being used by, the folks that I interviewed, or perhaps even the folks who are in attendance, because these are people that are already kind of have an interest or understanding in the system. And I thought it was interesting to kind of do it within a community planning program where my program had been around for 10 years. No one had ever looked at trails. Um, even parks is not really addressed within the context of a community planning school. It's largely focused on, land use planning and development, and whatever that be. Obviously, parks and trails are a component of that. And I think parks and trails are a component of a healthy community and a healthy province. So kind of bringing some light to that was part of my intention, and like improving the understanding of how trails have happened and how they do happen. And just really providing a overview of the process and then kind of poking at some potential, things that this trail planning system should be looking at or how it could be improved.
Yeah.
And just hopefully, anyone who has an interest in trails, whether that's a council, whether that's a community planner who now has, to sit on the local trails working group and they don't know anything about trails, or, whether that's someone who's just started to volunteer at their, local trail association. It's kind of like that, just like this is an overview. It's touching on a lot. Probably could have been more specific in parts, but it's a complex system, and I kind of wanted to shine light on that.
Well, thank you very much. We're almost out of time here. Aviva, if you could send that to everyone, I think you've got a survey there you're hoping to send out from Mountain Bike BC there. You just sent it to the host and panelists. Um, and I think we've got almost all the questions. There's one last there about the backcountry horsemen of BC and the recreation equine trail users. And
Mhm.
um, do you have any response there for Deb about
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there was definitely a lot of it seemed to be a general assumption that I was speaking specifically maybe to mountain biking or general trail hikers, whatever it be. The intention was trails as a whole, and any recreational user group. So, backcountry horsemen have long been involved in BC trail planning, and it varies between communities. They're very involved in certain communities and they don't exist in others. So I think I don't remember my exact diagram that I created, but they would fall within, you know, recreational user groups or advocacy groups. Um, yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to read some of the comments at the same time as answering them. My apologies.
No, no, I know that I have the same challenge trying to pay attention to both at the same time. But we're out of time there. I see Aviva is asking if folks are interested, they can take a survey there from Mountain Bike BC for all trail users. It's in the chat. There's a link there for everyone to be able to click on if you want. And I think we're going to just wrap things up here. So, Erik, thank you very much for taking part with us today. I'm just going to share my screen one more time. And just close things off. So, yeah, keep an eye on your inboxes this week for an email with a recording of today's webinar, plus links and other material. Thank you all for tuning in and asking great questions. This webinar is part of a regular series. Our next one is in September and is water themed to coincide with BC Rivers Day. With the help of a couple of special guests, we're going to show how everyone who's recreating in BC is connected to the health of our waterways and give you some ideas of how you can get involved and chip in. To find out more about the webinar and everything else the Outdoor Recreation Council is doing, subscribe to the newsletter at orcbc.ca. Finally, please stick around for the survey. It's a great place to let us know about anything you wish we covered today, any topics you'd like to hear in the future. It will load right after I stop talking. And with that, I'll say goodbye, good afternoon, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Erik, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And feel free to reach out anybody if you have follow-up questions. My email is just my name at gmail.com. So yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
We'll include that with the follow-up email as well. So
Great. Thanks,
excellent.
Ryan.
Thank you. Have a good day.